Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Marie-Pier Lemay, and I'm delighted to share this panel with Seunghyun. And the title of their talk is Epistemic Responsibility for Structural Remedies. And yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And I just want to start by just really genuinely and sincerely thanking Belly and Amandine for inviting me. Honestly, I don't know why I was invited because it's really such a privileging experience because the hotel is so fancy and it really honestly and the whole organization is such a gift because I haven't been able to do research for the past 2 years and this is the first time that I'm doing it. And I think I'm overdoing it, but I'm really enjoying myself. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I cannot say this enough. And yeah. I thought what I will do is to jump straight into the topic that I prepared for today, which is not working. So I will just use this, yes, which is epistemic responsibility for structural remedies. I will unpack why I changed the format a little bit. I first wanted to begin with the context in which my research arises, which is diagnosing or identifying a specific types of injustice. I don't have to go into detail, of course, because we all know the type of injustice that we're talking about. And the other aspect that I worry about a lot, which is doing something about injustice. And here I will talk briefly about reparation and remedies before I jump into epistemic responsibility for structural remedies. So that'll be the framework. I will be spending most of the time on the third part. So injustice. I want to particularly focus on something called colonial linguistic injustice for today. That refers to suppression and denigration of colonized people's languages during colonization and forced assimilation of colonized peoples to colonizers' languages. I don't have to give a lot of examples because everyone's aware of this, but just to go through three examples that I have in mind, which closely relates to the context here and also the people that I will draw from. So for instance, in Hong Kong, students who went to public schools faced corporeal and psychological punishment when they were caught speaking Cantonese in the school compounds under British regime. Indigenous children who were forcibly taken away from their families to boarding schools underwent obviously severe abuse and disempowerment and punishment due to the fact that they spoke indigenous languages which were not allowed. And for instance, in Korea, Korean scholars who worked on the publication of Korean dictionary during colonization were jailed and tortured and so on. What I want to focus on is basically identifying the types of harms that arose because of colonial linguistic injustice. And here, please forgive me if I use ideal theory. It is where I am trained. I also want to note that I am aware of the limits of this tool, but hopefully I will be able to use it so that I imply certain nuance or show certain nuance. But the first harm of colonial linguistic injustice is something that I conceptualize as linguistic alienation. And you might see it already in me because I'm also a migrant. I learned English, and this particular linguistic alienation is something that also happened in colonial linguistic injustice, where individuals formed an awkward, nervous, and insecure relation with their languages of origin or socialization, and as well as with the newly adopted language. And the reason why I appeal to me is because of the fact that newly adopted language, English, I speak insecurely. But for colonial linguistic injustice, what happened is that it happened to their languages of socialization and origin as well. In order to articulate this, I will show a couple of slides later. The second harm is hierarchical diglossia, basically that different strata of the world becomes divided into separate linguistic spheres, which were not the case before, where these spheres, strata, form a hierarchical relationship. and individuals are no longer able to enjoy continuous harmony. I will just go through specific quotes here. For instance, Ray Chow, not like a native speaker. This book is really, really enjoyable to read. She's a strong critique of Fanon, Gugi, and Benjamin, and all these different frameworks that she conjoins together to formulate her own experiences and post-colonial experience of languaging, as she calls, where she describes a continual disciplined objectification of one's intimate part of themselves, namely your own mother tongue. And this happens because of the colonial education where you are taught to alienate and estrange yourself from what is yours, right? And this is an echoing of obviously a famous passage of Fanon where basically a Martinican who enters into Europe, when they speak French, which they speak as their first language or their functioning language, they furtively observe their own speech and the reaction of the others, thereby being suspicious of one's own tongue, right? And Derrida also echoes this in his Monolingualism of the Other, and you can find many different renditions of this experience in many different post-colonial scholars. So that's what I coin as linguistic alienation. That's the first harm. The second harm is hierarchical diglossia. Now, Ngugi wa Thiong'o mentions this in his experience in Kenya, where basically Kenyan children used to speak Gikuyu, which used to hold different strata of the world together. However, after colonial education, what happens is that there is a higher and a lower strata of the world where basically one is spoken and is understood in English, whereas Gikuyu is now restricted to the lower realm. This is the colonial linguistic injustice that I have in mind, which I think is a clear type of injustice, which I think has not received justice at all. Now, there are two ways of understanding this injustice. First is to understand it as a historical injustice, which means that the victims and the perpetrators of this injustice is now past, they're dead and they're gone. Where the effect of it may remain. So this is to treat it as an event that happened in the past, which is no longer repeating or continuously occurring today, but the effect of it continues. That's not the type of approach that I'm interested in. I developed something called structural linguistic injustice, where basically I focus more on how currently decried institutional measures such as language policies are being reproduced through individual practices, through thousands of individuals' daily norm-abiding actions that position linguistic groups in hierarchical social relations. Obviously, the structurally disadvantaged linguistic groups will face more harm, such as linguistic alienation, language loss, language death, etc., which I will not discuss today. Now, just to briefly explain what I mean by individual practices that enable structural linguistic injustice. There are problematic or objectionable language attitudes. I have in particular the objectionable language attitudes such as speaking English is better than speaking a minority language because it's conducive for social advancement. Very norm-abiding, very commonsensical even, but which results at a collective level, language loss and assimilation, etc. Now, I have signaled injustice. I'm going to move on to what should be done. Here's my assumption, which is really not at all shared, at least in linguistic justice. If an injustice once committed, we have the duty to rectify it. So if a language was suppressed and denigrated in time 1, in time 2, language must be revitalized and revalorized. Now, this is an argument that I make in my field, but it's not really that common because there's an idea that once you have assimilated to a language, then it's difficult to exit. And another thing is that if you're going to submerge your, for instance, next generation in a particular language, which one is more beneficial, right? So basically, in order to argue for revitalization, the type of remedies or reparation that I have advocated until now is that of revitalization. Now, I have endorsed nationalist and institutional understanding reparation until now, where I advocated territorial protection and promotion of a target language, i.e. colonized language, through status planning, which is to, for instance, explicitly practice certain valorization and of a language as a cultural heritage, or by corpus planning, which is to establish certain dictionaries, understanding of grammar, and so on. Now, that is not enough. The reason why I say that is not enough is because of the problematic and objectionable practices that are still out there, such as learning English is more beneficial than learning minority languages. And how are you going to fix that? I have been reading a lot and thinking a lot about this topic, and I realized there is an epistemic barrier, and that's why I resorted to the epistemic injustice debate. At least that was the first reason why I entered it. And I also have another parallel project that I work on, which is colonial sexual slavery, but I'm focusing on the language for today. In order to offer structural remedies, I realized that we need to be not principled, as I was sharing in my previous comments, because I wanted to share and think alongside together, but also the type of remedies that you might prescribe really depends on the context. So this means that you are heavily dependent on the network and the communities that you are working with at that moment in order to revitalize certain languages. In order for these remedies to occur, one dimension is knowledge. I will rephrase what I just said in a different way. In order for structural remedies to successfully occur, there are several conditions that need to be met. One of the conditions is epistemic. Young herself acknowledges this by saying, for instance, responsible moral agents must obtain significant knowledge of how the actions of individuals and the rules and the purposes of institutions conspire to produce injustice. But it is very unclear what kind of knowledge is this. So that's my project. That I want to flesh out what this knowledge is. And this is why I coined a term, epistemic responsibility for structural remedies. I identified 3 types of knowledge, which is heuristic, prescriptive, and knowledge of accountability. I won't linger too long on this because I want to get to my ethics part, but I was very much moved by Eric, which I don't see now. Hi, Eric, who basically shared his own experience, which I thought was so powerful. So I thought, why not resort back to experiences that we all share, I guess, because we all have different intersections of burdens. So for instance, imagine a situation where in a knowledge building process, you are excluded, whereas the other person who assumes structural privilege does not, i.e. in the academia, where you, for instance, will be excluded because of your identity, right? I think in these situations, in order to achieve genuine structural changes, you need heuristic knowledge. Heuristic basically means diagnostic. What kind of social processes are out there that are enabling structural injustice, which places marginalized people in a disadvantaged position, whereas privileged people are not, right? For instance, how networking works, how boys' clubs work, et cetera, that places people who are marginalized outside of that circle. You need to know what kind of processes are there, such as dinners, membership to a certain network where you're only invited to, and so on, right? So these are the diagnostics or heuristic knowledge that I'm referring to. Prescriptive knowledge is knowing how to change these social processes. What are better ways of changing and not doing and counterbalancing these already existing networks so that it becomes more inclusive? And here I allude to, for instance, searching for safe space, such as this conference, or other types of venues that you can try to articulate as an alternative. Knowledge of accountability refers to knowing whether further reparation or compensation should be required in addition to structural changes. Just because structural changes are made, that doesn't mean that now justice is complete. Those who were excluded in the past, those who were placed in disadvantaged positions, must be owed compensation. And that's where I get a little bit backward looking. Again, this is what I mean by knowledge, and I implore you to remember this, because now I get to the contentious part. I don't remain in describing what kind of types of knowledge are out there. I want to basically articulate and describe what kind of responsibilities moral actors have in fulfilling structural remedies. And I want to identify one particular type of responsibility that is altogether kind of passed over in structural injustice debate, which is structural epistemic responsibility. Here I refer to epistemic responsibility that responsible moral agents bear to fulfill the epistemic condition of structural remedy, obtaining these knowledges that I have highlighted before. I want to identify two particular types of structural epistemic responsibility. First one is participatory responsibility. Second one is organizational responsibility. Participatory responsibility refers to moral actors' responsibility to participate in knowledge building processes that share knowledge for structural remedy. Namely, if you are aware of which types of social processes are objectionable or problematic, how it should be changed, what you are owed, you might have to participate in the knowledge building process. Those moral actors and others and those who do not have participatory responsibility might also have organizational responsibility. I was trying to signal that these two responsibilities do not exclude each other and it could be compatible to each other. The moral actors who have the organizational responsibility have the duty to basically organize, share actions, so to allow sharing certain knowledge, so to allow sharing of certain knowledge for structural remedy to occur at a collective level. My apologies for the typos. Let me go into it in a bit more detail. Now, participatory responsibility is something that I came up with the idea of structurally disadvantaged individuals. Despite the fact that they might have lesser political responsibility, they may have more epistemic privilege by having access to particular location relative experience and specific knowledge of social process and consequences. They might bear participatory responsibility. We have talked in detail about many different reasons why this is problematic, and I agree with you all. I wanted to come up with a way forward without remaining that we have the right to occlude, we have the right to stop, we have the right to disengage, we have the right to resist. One way of doing that, I thought, was to talk about what kind of skills do we have. And I was talking about this with a friend of mine who was telling me how he could clock something. If somebody approaches you with the intention to exploit, to extract, to make you and render you transparent, so to be subject you to a certain oppressive epistemic dynamic, my belief is that we are able to discern whether certain people are exploitative and non-exploitative. And fulfilling a participatory responsibility is to exercise the skill that we have, this epistemic, this way of forming an epistemic relation. So I wanted to start articulating not that you have to, for instance, simply share knowledge that you have, but that you get to choose who to share with, when to share with, and how. And again, please bear with me that when I say knowledge, I'm not talking about knowledge of survival. I'm talking about knowledge of change. I'm talking about knowledge for structural remedies and not about some things that we want to keep for ourselves, right? Secondly, what I wanted to talk about is, well, basically, well, I will talk about it later. Lastly, is the second aspect that I want to talk about is organizational responsibility, and this is something that I had in particular for structurally privileged individuals who often are culpably, perniciously, excusably sometimes ignorant and fail to understand how mundane and norm-abiding actions may conspire to serious collective harms. But they have structural standing to organize collective actions that may facilitate structural change. Here, what I want to, well, actually, I'm a bit torn. I don't know whether this is something that reflected enough about all the difficulties that, for instance, Veli highlighted this morning. So I would have to think a bit more on this. As a finalizing remark, I wanted to revert back to the assumption that I had that once an injustice has been committed, it needs to be rectified. To this kind of quite backward-looking claim, I want to additionally add that, and I will speak jargon just to introduce my idea. When it comes to epistemic repair, epistemic reparation, or the change in the ways in which we relate to each other as knowers, I don't think that temporal orientation of justice, either you be forward-looking or backward-looking, can coexist. And this is the reason why I think that among the three types of knowledges that I have just outlined, there might be a hierarchy. So I don't think that heuristic knowledge, diagnostic knowledge, which is what we often occupy ourselves with, what is wrong, I don't think it has a priority. So I think that when it comes to sharing your knowledge, it's okay if you don't quite know what is wrong, insofar as what you know is correct, and how what other additional things need to be done. The reason why I am not pluralist in that regard for the structure, that I'm not a pluralist for temporal orientations of justice is because I care about epistemic reparation and epistemic repair. And I will just end with a hypothetical that I have been thinking about for quite a long time, which has less to do with this particular case study, but another one in hopes of prolonging this network. Imagine that a person had been assaulted and that a friend has denied their experience of assault. Now, this friend who had committed a denial, after years of education in feminism, realizes that they had committed a denial. Now, this person is better. And after this, they say, oh, I have experienced this education, now I know better. So this is for the person that I had denied. I don't think that's epistemic reparation. I think if you go and do additional things in order to admit that you had first committed a denial, and second, that you have additional things that you have to offer, such as acknowledgement, apology, fine, compensation of some sort, social sanction that you willingly embrace, and so on. I think that should be considered backward-looking. But the education that you received is forward-looking, which is not always the case for other types of reparation, such as money. Because I am led by this epistemic case, I also want to invite, for a few of you who are here who care deeply about temporal orientations of justice, that you cannot be pluralist, not all the time. Okay, thank you so much.